All right, folks, my next guest is a lawyer, author, television pundit, and LIGNET contributor, and we've had him on before, but not in the studio. I'm glad to welcome in Gordon Chang. And Gordon, great to see you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming in. All right, we have a lot to talk about. The situation in Hong Kong, police using tear gas and rubber bullets, the whole thing. Banks had to close to protect the workers. Explain what the pro-democracy, I mean, it might be an obvious question, but what exactly is the pro-democracy movement, and what has spurred them, and what are they hoping to accomplish with regard to the government of Hong Kong and China's control over it?
The next election for Hong Kong's chief executive, which is the top political officer, is in 2017. And what people are fighting over is the procedures for that election. Beijing has said that there can be universal suffrage, but Beijing also demands nominating procedures that are so restrictive that essentially Beijing gets to pick who runs. And so the people in Hong Kong are saying, no way. What we want to do is have an open nominating process so that anybody can run, and therefore that's what the issue is about. It is about democracy, because they would be sham elections if Beijing got its way.
All right, and what's the likelihood of success? And you're talking about 2017, you said?
Yes.
So it's a long road between now and then. How much will this effort grow, and how tough will the government get against this pro-democracy group?
Well, I think both the government in Hong Kong and in China are going to be very tough. And the reason is they're worried about democracy contagion. If the people in Hong Kong can actually vote in meaningful elections, then the people in Shanghai are going to say, well, what about me? Right. And indeed, yesterday there was a demonstration in the middle of Shanghai where people were expressing sympathy for the people in Hong Kong, but they were also saying, we in China should have the vote. And that's what really Beijing is worried about.
Are we going to see another Tiananmen Square situation?
Well, you know, it's possible, because today Chinese state media talked about Beijing sending in the People's Armed Police, which is essentially an arm of the military, into Hong Kong if the Hong Kong authorities could not control the situation. As we saw on both Saturday and Sunday, and also today, the Hong Kong authorities have lost control, and people in Beijing must be wondering, you know, it's time to send in the troops.
But on the other hand, they're talking about Taiwan. The piece in the Wall Street Journal today talking about how that these protests and the way they're being handled, it makes it very tough for Beijing for Beijing to win over the hearts of the Taiwanese people. Is that I mean, talk about that aspect and that angle of it.
Yeah, essentially what Beijing is saying is there's a one country, two systems for Hong Kong. So you got one country, China, but two systems, one in Hong Kong, one in China.
Right.
And Xi Jinping just a couple days ago talked about the one country, two systems formula for Taiwan.
Yeah.
Now, people in Taiwan are saying, well, look what's happening in Hong Kong. Do we want this for ourselves? Also, many of the people in Taiwan don't view themselves as Chinese. They view themselves as Taiwanese. And so they say, well, yeah, okay, that's China, but this is Taiwan. And so there's a number of issues there. But clearly, you know, when it comes to one country, two systems, that's a non-starter. It was a non-starter last year, but it's certainly a non-starter today.
Yeah. Well, when all is said and done, how far does China, or the Hong Kong government, or whatever you want to call them, how far do they go? I mean, we mentioned another Tiananmen Square, you said that they're sending in, but I mean, will they bow to world pressure? Do they care about world pressure or what the world would say or think or do?
Yeah, I think they do care, but also they care much more about staying in power. And if they really believe, and I think that they do, that the Hong Kong demonstrations are an existential threat, they will do what is necessary to stay in power. Got to remember, their reference point is 1989, where although they killed a lot of people, they did that to create a lesson on the Chinese people that the Communist Party was willing to spill blood, and they got away with it.
Subsequently, Madeleine Albright went over and toasted they called them the butchers of Beijing.
Right.
What can America do? What should this administration do at this point, or as we progress, to support the demonstrators in Hong Kong, if anything?
Yeah, we actually don't need to support them, and the reason is that they're doing pretty fine on their own. You know, I think, of course, we need rhetorical support and the rest of it. But the only thing we need to do is get out of the way, because the people in Hong Kong have made it very clear that this is their city, that this is their future, and they're not going to allow Beijing to mess in it. And actually, that's all we really need to have.
Gordon, we got about 2 minutes left. I want to touch on this piece about China, militaristic, of course, and you know, I've been talking about the threat from China with you and others for many years. Do they see that their advantage, their military edge, coming from space?
Well, clearly they see that the U.S. military is very dependent on space for communications and for linkages. And so, they realize that if they take down our satellites, they basically leveled the playing field. And that's why, we saw that 2007 anti-satellite test. And then we've seen more of them since then. Beijing has clearly made it very clear that they are going to dominate the high ground of space. And we really need to respond to that because we don't have much of a military if it can't communicate with each other, because that's the way that we train to fight. And so we absolutely need to make sure that our satellites are safe.
And do we have the will and capacity to do that these days?
I hope so, but we don't spend enough money. We're not spending nearly enough compared to what the Chinese are doing. And the Chinese have stolen so much technology that they really have, in many ways, leveled the playing field. Not exactly, but nonetheless, they're making great strides.
Yeah, and that's not good news. And I always worry about a hack attack that would affect our electric grid, not only from China, but certainly they'd be a prime suspect to launch something like that. Great insight, great information. Thank you for coming up. I hope to see you again soon. Gordon Chang, ladies and gentlemen, and of course, LIGNET contributor. We have a lot more to talk about. We'll be back with radio host and best-selling author Kevin Jackson, and we're going to talk about the president's words on Ferguson when he spoke to the Congressional Black Caucus over the weekend. First, February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first man to orbit the Earth, as well as a symbol of American ambition. Talking about space, let's take a look back now with this hour's American Moment. Don't go away.
He had served in 2 wars and flown over 150 combat missions. But in just 60 seconds, this Marine Corps officer would experience a ride like no other. At 9:47 a.m., on the 20th of February, 1962, Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn, Jr. of New Concord, Ohio, found himself sitting on top of an Atlas 6 rocket filled with 600,000 pounds of fuel. At liftoff, 360,000 pounds of thrust hurled the massive rocket and its occupant into space and America's history books. John Glenn became the 4th human being to enter space and the first American to orbit the Earth. For his remarkable heroism, President Kennedy awarded Colonel Glenn NASA's Distinguished Service Medal.
As our knowledge of this universe in which we live increases, may God grant us the wisdom and guidance to use it wisely. Thank you, Colonel.
Glenn went on to become the United States Senator from Ohio, and in 1984 ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, but lost to Walter Mondale. You're watching An American Moment on Newsmax TV.